which lead to various health impacts that are disproportionately prevalent in those communities. And even as we try to make a shift away from fossil fuel-based energy production, we have this challenge around moving towards fracking, which, as we know, is contaminating water. It's making it unhealthy for folks to drink, or even increasing explosivity of water. And then the process of fracking, in terms of drilling into the earth, has been tied to the increase in seismic activity in places like Oklahoma, that used to have 35 earthquakes above 3.5 on the Richter scale, and now they have annually, and now they're averaging over 350 earthquakes above 3.5 on the Richter scale, and geologists are directly tying it to the proliferation of fracking, which has led to the conversation around the fracking ban in Oklahoma. Okay, now the slide going is a lot quicker. And so these are the ways that we see the pollution going, the routes that go into your body, whether it's through air pollution from the smokestacks and so forth, from manufacturing or energy production, water pollution, whether it's through runoff or other ways that the water ends up being polluted, and we end up drinking it, or we end up eating the fish that are contaminated and so forth. And soil contamination, whether it's because air pollution then comes down in acid rain, or because of also runoff and other impacts. And then with the NAACP, because we work on multiple issues, we started to see the intersection with some of the social justice issues that we work on, including education, health, economic justice, and even criminal justice. And this image kind of tells that story. On the upper right-hand corner, there's a little boy named Antoine, and in the upper left-hand corner is the medicine that he's relying on to get from day to day. He lives 2 miles away from a coal-fired power plant and has asthma, and has pretty severe asthma, such that he is often not able to go to school like other kids because of poor air quality days, because of his asthma. And when we put together these factors in terms of the fact that African American kids are 3 to 5 times more likely to enter into the hospital from asthma attack, and 2 to 3 times more likely to die from asthma attack, we see the level of prevalence that asthma has in those communities. And so if kids aren't able to go to school because of poor air quality days, like a lot of kids with asthma have a high rate of absenteeism. Kids are in school but having a hard time paying attention because another thing that comes out of the smokestacks is lead and other types of toxins that interfere with learning. And then if you're living near a toxic facility, on average, your property values are 15% lower. And we all know that it's property values that actually funds our educational system. So we start to see how all of these combine to negatively impact educational attainment. And studies show that if you're not on grade level by the 3rd grade, you're more likely to enter into the school to prison pipeline, which is the reason for the fourth picture there. So that's on one side of the environmental injustice in terms of how these pollutants impact communities. But then on the other side, we know that a lot of these same polluting facilities are also emitting the greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change. And so we see some of the very same communities being disproportionately vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So whether it's because of poor housing stock, or it's because of lack of insurance, or it's because of lacking infrastructure that would protect communities from flooding. There's so many ways that many of these communities are disproportionately impacted by the impacts of disaster. And this is just a kind of as the NAACP has gotten involved around this, we've developed a number of resolutions around climate change, around energy, and the ways that we need to shift away from the polluting, the greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth. So this is just kind of a sampling of some of the resolutions we've passed over the years. And our programmatic objectives are around reducing harmful emissions, basically reducing pollution, advancing a justice-based energy agenda, which is focused on energy efficiency and clean energy, and strengthening community resilience, particularly in the context of climate adaptation. So with reducing pollution, we have been focusing on coal-fired power plants. This is, I think, a plant in Orlando and Orange County. We put out a report, Cold-Blooded Putting Profits Before People, and then we put out a cold-blooded action toolkit. So the report provides kind of a survey and analysis of the coal plants and the communities it impacts, and then the action toolkit helps people to figure out what kind of actions they can take in the face of coal pollution. How do they negotiate? How do they develop a local ordinance? How do they negotiate with the plant owners in their area? How do they negotiate with the legislators? How do they do community organizing to help to educate the community about the impact of coal? And how do they eliminate coal pollution in their communities? So this is the ways that the unit engagement, unit is basically our branches and chapters. And these are some of the ways that our units are engaged around this particular objective. So launching community-based campaigns to close coal plants, making sure they're being represented at state and local tables for planning and implementation of projects, passing local ordinances on clean air, developing community science campaigns. We just did a youth-focused community science campaign in East Chicago, Indiana, a couple of weeks ago. And this is some of the work that we have done over the last year in particular around this objective. So some of the successes around coal plants that have stopped burning, making sure that we're speaking truth to power. These are some of the meetings that have happened with state legislators and in these regions. We've put comments in around the Clean Power Plan. In Jackson County, they managed to pass an ordinance around banning injection wells because they were concerned about an injection well that would have gone and potentially impacted their aquifer. And then, like I said, the launch of the Indiana Youth Community Science Project. So this is some of the work that's happened in Indiana. They pushed back and defeated a bill that would have made solar more expensive. They've done these community education campaigns and so forth. And in Mississippi, similarly, they've done some community education campaigns, even a billboard campaign around one of these polluting coal plants, and they were able to get the Jack Watson plant to stop burning coal as of last year. This is some images from the launch of the community science project in Indiana. And this is the images of us where we're going, and we're testifying in front of the EPA around the mercury neurotoxics rule and the clean power plan. So again, making sure that we're speaking truth to power and having an influence around the equity measures that need to be put in place around regulations. And these are some of the tools that we have available and resources. I know one of the questions that came in advance of this call was wanting to know what kind of tools and resources we have available. So we have our cold-blooded toolkit, we have our cold-blooded action toolkit, we have our youth community science project guide, we have our environmental and climate justice kind of comprehensive advocacy toolkit. And those are the ones that are pertinent for that particular objective. And I'll show you some other tools that we have for our other two objectives as well. So our second objective, as I said, is advancing energy justice, basically energy efficiency and clean energy. We put out a report, Just Energy Policies, Reducing Pollution, Creating Jobs, and it was focused on how do we advance energy efficiency, how do we advance solar, wind, and geothermal. A reminder of some of our resolutions that we have that kind of underpin our energy work. And then these are just some of the ways that our units have gotten involved. So, so supporting energy efficiency and clean energy legislation, including energy efficiency resource standards, renewable portfolio standards, net metering and distributed generation policies, community solar, community energy choice, local hire provisions, disadvantaged business enterprise provisions, and fair chance hiring. As we said, we really are very intersectional in how we focus. So fair chance hiring is making sure that there's not discrimination against formerly incarcerated persons as they come out and are endeavoring to be, contributing members of society. And so these are some more ways that units are engaged around the energy efficiency work, doing demonstration projects. So not just passing the policies, but actually implementing projects on energy efficiency and clean energy, making sure that there's just transition models. So when we advocate to shut down a coal-fired power plant, making sure that it actually, that the workers aren't displaced and they don't lose their livelihoods, that there's alternatives for those workers. Hosting educational summits and consultative summits to bring folks together to talk about the opportunities in the new energy economy. And the Power Up Employment Project is something we're piloting in Colorado Springs, in Chicago, in Baltimore, and in Seattle, which will actually do workforce development with formerly incarcerated persons around solar installation. So these are just some of the places where we've launched our Just Energy campaigns to pass these types of policies in Ohio and Minnesota and Utah, Wisconsin, and many places. This is where we did the launch in Michigan in 2014. This is where some of the fruits of our labor. After we launched the project in Missouri, then we saw the introduction of a House bill pushing for mandatory energy efficiency resource or performance standards there. And some of the folks we work with around the demonstration projects includes Robert Wallace, who's a multimillionaire who's built his empire from clean energy and energy efficiency. So he's written several books on it, including this Green Gold book. Some of our other partners include Grid Alternatives, with whom we just did a solar installation where they trained a number of our staff members. We got up on a rooftop in Baltimore and installed a free solar system for a lower income community member, because Grid Alternatives only does installations for people who have who are households with 80% below the area median income. And this is another exciting campaign, actually, where it started. It was kind of from grim to a good outcome. This place, Highland Park, which is outside of Detroit, they had a situation where DTE, the energy utility, had shut off their electricity because they not the whole town, the streetlight electricity, because they had failed to pay their bills. And so they had not only shut off the electricity, they went to the streetlights, but then they went through and they actually took away the street poles as well. And so the community decided to come together, and they crowdsourced, and they were able to get enough resources to be able to buy street poles, and then to get little solar powered street lights. And now they're back in the light again after having suffered in the dark after the heartless shutting off of their lights by DTE. So that is a good story of kind of overcoming, the challenges of poverty, which made them have to be in situations of peril, because it was an area that had some challenges with crime, which certainly worsened when there was no lights to protect them. And so these are some of the recent progress we've made around energy efficiency and clean energy in the past year. We've held these energy justice trainings where we've trained 150 plus NAACP leaders from 47 states. The NAACP in Portland, Oregon was instrumental in the introduction of the 100% renewable energy ordinance. The NAACP leadership in Fairbanks, Alaska was instrumental in getting a Solar in Your Community grant from the Department of Energy. And so now they have a planning grant to implement a community solar project. And community solar projects have been launched in Saginaw, Michigan, Anchorage, Alaska, and Gary, Indiana. This is one of our energy justice training programs. One of the training that we did in San Francisco with people from Gulfport, Mississippi, and Hawaii. Gulfport, everybody else is from Hawaii. And so these are some of the resources around that particular objective. So we have our Just Energy Policies report. We have a guidance document about how to engage with your public utilities commissions or your public service commissions. We have another guidance document around how to negotiate with the solar industry to make sure that they have more equitable opportunities in the solar industry. And then we have a toolkit that we're coming out with in mid-November called the Just Energy Policies Toolkit. So when we talk about strengthening community resilience, we put out a document a couple of years ago called Equity and Resilience Building for Climate Adaptation Indicators document. So it was a guide for city planners to think about the types of indicators they need to be thinking about as they do planning for real equity in their climate adaptation planning. And so we've been working with our local units to establish equity-based climate action plans, to establish eco-district plans. And where there are existing plans already, then we work with our units, our branches and chapters, to be able to sit at those tables and make sure that equity is prominent in those plans. And then we work with our units on establishing projects that build resilience and that help communities to adapt to climate change impacts. So whether it's stormwater management projects, land or housing equity projects, because of the housing insecurity that results from a lot of these climate impacts, sea level rise plans and policies, local food justice plans and policies, community emergency response teams, zoning laws that help to protect folks from being in harm's way in terms of having toxic facilities that then interact with disaster. And then this is just some of the work that's happened in different places in Maryland and Gulfport, in Florida, where folks are just coming together and putting these eco district projects together. In Longview, Texas, they launched a local food project and a recycling project. In Gulfport, Mississippi, on the left, they developed a series of local food projects as well. They got a master gardener who then trained other people who were to raise local food, and they were starting to really actively address some of the food insecurity issues that existed in Gulfport, Mississippi. In Biloxi, Mississippi, in the lower right, they developed an equity and emergency management action team that acts as a watchdog in disasters to make sure that resources are being distributed equitably and that vulnerable communities are being properly taken care of in those situations. In the lower left-hand corner, that's a high school class in Gulfport watching Beasts of the Southern Wild, which is a film that talks a lot about climate resilience in a lot of ways. So we use that as a muse to then talk about what climate resilience means to those students in Gulfport. And this is some other community meetings where people are coming together, developing a vision for what they want for climate resilience in their communities. This is just, again, a list of some of the recent projects that we've done: the launch of the Florida Master Plan on Environmental and Climate Justice, developing and implementing a resilience convening and training with people from 11 different branches and chapters. We administered 8 resilience planning grants to these different communities. We, like I said before, launched that climate action plan in Portland, Oregon. We've been doing these sea level rise trainings where we work with Climate Central and NOAA to help people to be able to predict what the sea level rise impacts might be in their communities. We've similarly done emergency management trainings where we partner with FEMA to help people to think about what disaster impacts, where the vulnerabilities might lie in their communities, and how they can plan. We've facilitated the launch of some of the local food projects I told you about, Gulfport and Longview, also a aquaponics project in Anchorage, and another aquaponics project in Indianapolis. And then, we've seen some of our work around preparing for disasters have to really go right into action with the disaster response to Irma, Harvey, then Maria. This was written before Maria came through. And then these are some of the tools that we have around the equity and resilience building work. Our equity and resilience building for climate adaptation indicators document, our equity and emergency management monitoring tool, and then teaching intersectionality and environmental justice in the classroom to prepare our students to be able to be more aware of and ready to address environmental and climate justice issues out there. And then just in addition to kind of some of these pieces that are kind of technical and community and policy and so forth and demonstration projects, we also want to make sure that we are, as more groups start to work together across differences, race, class, etc., we want to be very intentional about how that's done in terms of being intentional about everything from social cohesion to making sure that the leadership in this new energy economy, in this new, more resilient world, that there's more leadership from frontline communities, and that we have a way of doing that that doesn't result in conflict and so forth amongst communities. So we really need to be intentional about how that's done. So we put together this document, and the people shall lead, centralizing frontline community leadership in the movement towards a sustainable planet. And it really gives some tips to how we organize across differences. And as I said, we put together teaching intersectionality in the classroom. So we also start people young thinking about these things. What is their role in advancing a more sustainable planet as well? And put out some thought pieces as well. I put this out, I guess, earlier this year. Diversity is not enough, and done alone, it can be counterproductive. Because as we start to see funders pushing for more diversity, more partnership, and so forth, it could easily kind of put folks in harm's way in terms of not doing diversity in a way that's thoughtful, that's intentional, and that's deliberative. And then because there's these cultural differences and so forth, if not done right, it can actually be harmful to the folks involved, both the person of color and other folks, and not just around color, but other differences as well. So how do we think about diversity in a way that is thoughtful, that's rooted in principle, and then our practices follow our principles, but that we also kind of recognize that we've been raised in a racist, patriarchal, sexist, all the isms society. And so it's not just a matter of where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, it is true that where there's a will, there's a way, but we have to be very deliberative about what that way is, because we just don't know how to do it in a lot of ways. We have to unlearn a lot of the patterns of society that we've all been reared in. And so we also are very intentional about talking about how to shift the narrative. There's a lot of false narratives out there, solar is only for rich people, and or white people, or all these different things that, we hear job killing regulations as opposed to life preserving regulations. So how do we make sure that we who are in the front lines, we who are kind of on the justice side of the struggle, are starting to move away from these false narratives that are out there? There's a famous proverb: until lions write their own history, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. That I was on a humorous note watching Saturday Night Live one day, and I feel like they told the story even better than a lot of the ways that we say it, where they were doing, the weekend update thing that they do. They had this kind of fake news story basically, and it was saying that a hunter had killed a deer, and then he thought the deer was dead, but when he went to check it, that the deer rose up and gored him, and the headline in the local newspaper was hunter thinking deer was dead, was injured as a deer jumped up and gored him. So deer attacks hunter. But then it said, or as told in the deer community, serial killer injured as victim fights back. And so that's where we see like the importance of who tells the story. And it's all about perspective, because, when the hunter is always telling the story, then he's kind of the heroic person and the deer is the villain. But really, who's got the gun and who's the innocent, vulnerable creature out there that's being hunted down. So I thought that definitely told it all. So these are some of the ways that we've been making sure that we're telling our own story, getting op-eds from our frontline community folks, placed into local newspapers and placed into online newspapers, and getting folks interviewed on television and so forth, just to really start getting our stories out there, our perspective out there, our frame, our narrative out there. And then this is just some of the ways that we've partnered across our departments, making sure that we are, well, I won't go into all those, but and then we also are partnering across nations. We have this global Afro-descendant leadership climate justice project, and it's in partnership with the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, because really, even as we think about pushing out coal, now we see this uptick in coal exports. As we think about pushing out natural gas, we see this uptick in LNG exports. So how do we connect with folks across the pond and make sure that we're being intentional and responsible about what the impacts of our policy advocacy may be in protecting our own communities, but maybe having harmful impacts on other vulnerable nations? And so really making sure that we're working hand in hand with these groups. And so when we talk about, some of the principles that underlie working across differences, principles and practices of environmental climate justice movement building, the Jemez principles are kind of cornerstone principles that we talk about in this work. And then these are just some of the ways that some of the folks have worked together at the local level, doing educational sessions, film screenings, special speakers, healing walks, community cleanups, green job fairs, and then more substantive things, not that those aren't substantive, but anyway, establishing a sanctuary city or town or school, doing work around getting out the vote, establishing clean air ordinances together, working on zero waste projects together, green school projects together, community owned solar, local food movements, eco districts, starting a community emergency response team, running for office, doing a deep democracy project, people volunteering with the local EJ group, not just trying to get folks to do what we want them to do as environmental groups or otherwise, but like really getting in and volunteering with the EJ group or whatever social justice group or frontline group there is, really being intentional about cultivating cross-movement organizing anti-oppression training, because as I said, we all need to have a different orientation around oppression because of our society. Making sure that equity is integrated into local climate action plans and equity is integrated into emergency management plans. And then this is just a kind of to give you a sense of who we are as the NAACP team around this. This is Jane English in the upper left-hand corner, our program manager. In the middle, our administrative coordinator, Katrina Cousins. There's me, our program specialist, Marcus Franklin. Katie Taylor's our communications person. These are our field fellows, Marnice, from the right, Marnice, and then to her, next to her is Laura. Mustafa is actually an EPA person, and then Ryan Kelly. And then also we have Deirdre, who's on the left here, Liz, who's in the middle, and Swetha, who's on the right. That's our whole team. And then we have an honorary team member who's with our legal department, whose name is Keela Crane. And then just wrapping up by saying, we really do honor and love working with partners like UUA and others. And, that we really do feel like our work must be rooted in love and cooperation and interdependence. And on that note from Martin Luther King, we have before us a glorious opportunity to inject a new dimension of love into the veins of our civilization. So thank you very much. And yeah, that's a bit of an overview of what we do.